Welcome to the latest episode of the Inspiration Forum's podcast series Screenshot, this time with members of an artistic group Total Refusal, Leonhard Müllner and Robin Klengel. They describe the collective as pseudo-Marxist media guerrilla that explores the politics that permeate the most profitable entertainment medium of our time, video games. As part of the 26th Ji.hlava International Documentary Film Festival, they met in conversation with philosopher Václav Jánoščík.
What kind of refusal can we apply to gaming? Why do we need this as a strategy for, let's say, 21st century and the gaming culture and the society at large?
Total Refusal, we are a bunch of 6 people. And we have started with the subtitle Digital Disarmament Movement, digitale Abrüstungsbewegung, because most of the mainstream games we are focusing on are in a military setting. So our aim is to reuse digital games for a different kind of narration, because it's just like rebuilt, remodeled, simulated world from our world, like a kind of a pastiche. We use this French pretentious word very often. And it's just used for military purposes, like for playing war. And during one of the last works we are now working on, in the last years, we got more radicalized in the focus of what the medium actually is and where it comes from, besides this military industrial apparatus. We can talk about that a lot, but of course it's the poster boy of capitalism. It appears as a commercial media within of the rise of late capitalism, and it breathes this kind of bad smell, so flamboyant, that we need to focus on the material side of this media. So just one last sentence about that, maybe a lot of sentences. If you think of contemporary films, if you think of mainstream films, Marvel films, for example, blockbuster, or contemporary images from video games, it's not just that screenwriters and developers come together. There's always someone sitting next and controlling what is sellable. So the firms are very clear about that marketing departments are ruling which images leave into the market, to the masses, and which are not. So all the images we consume coming from mainstream media are filtered and manufactured by capitalist thinkings. And we call this kind of like, we don't call it, just not we, but a lot of people call it hyperrealism. So the imagery we are consuming are actually just marketing imagery. It's not just advertisement, it's also film. So if you think of a Marvel production, a Marvel film production, there are like 20 scenes or 15 scenes made for each kind of scene. And then those scenes are going into kind of survey, a marketing survey. And then the one which is the most consensual and marketable is going out. So we are seeing just fractures of capitalist marketing imagery. And the same goes with video games. So they probably decide which kind of character, which kind of idea of gender, which kind of idea of society, whatever story, what is the bad and what is the good, is filtered by capitalist logics. And so we became pseudo-Marxist, as we then had to really focus on materialist term. So what is driving the imageries? And by that, constructing the images we do have on every moment, we think of people we don't know, countries we don't know. They are uploaded on a kind of collective data bank, and this data bank is capitalistic imagery, of course.
But to come back to your question, we call ourselves Total Refusal, I guess, because we're dealing with computer games. So they're games after all, so they come with a certain set of rules. But the specific thing about video games very often is that those rules are they're not so obvious, actually. Like, they come with they're meant to be played in a certain way. But at the same time, often you enter the space of a video game, you have the feeling that actually this is a free world. You have this absurd feeling of freedom, even though the space is limited, and actually it follows a very specific tradition and trope, which is very repetitive very often. And what we found interesting in dealing with this medium is to play them somehow, to refuse the way they're meant to be played and to experiment with what else can be done within these sceneries, what other stories we could tell there, how can we play the game against itself. And as soon as you do that, it kind of gets a bit absurd and a bit funny, because you're doing something absurd, playing a game against itself. And that's kind of our basic principles in making our projects. But maybe it is a bit abstract if we just talk about this. Maybe it would be also, even now, be a good moment to play a clip of one of our works. I think the first one we'd like to start is also the first one that we developed. It's called Operation Jane Walk. And let's have a look. I think you will get the idea very fast. So we would like to play the clip now.
We sing this song, together we stand.
And let's just stop here to take a moment to appreciate this installation, modern sculpture, where the old ideas of individualized, motorized, gas-guzzling transport collides with the practical world of bicycles. The visions of traffic administrator Janet Seti Khan, who saw bicycle lanes, bus lanes, pedestrian areas as being healthy for the city, successful in places like Times Square, battling the old concepts of Moses, memorialized in this sculpture, quite brilliant by the game developers, whether they did it consciously or not. Okay, as we climb up here, we're going to admire the Pan Am building. Today is called the MetLife building, built in the 60s as a monument to the triumph of capitalism in the New World after World War II. Pan Am, of course, greatly profited from the Second World War, not just passenger aviation, but military aviation. All corporation headquarters we've seen on our tour profited greatly from World War II. The rise of the US synchronized with the rise of capitalism and with the victory over the Axis powers. This mighty complex in front of us is the poster boy for this story. Partially responsible, of course, is Le Corbusier, but the architect that finished it, Walter Gropius. Let's leave this uncomfortable situation, but stay flying in our ears with 1979 Pan Am song, We Fly the World, the airline's official advertising jingle. The last building here signifies a break in the narrative and in the history of New York. The 1960s saw economic growth, the 1970s, oil crisis. Through globalization, production sites move out of the cities and we see the deindustrialization of Manhattan. For the first time in history, Manhattan faces an exodus, and the city is close to bankruptcy. Banks take over governmental tasks. At the same time, the phenomenon of global cities emerges, as described by Saskia Sassen.
Yeah, so what you saw is part of actually the whole thing takes like 1.5 hours. It's a whole city tour that we have developed within the game called Division 1. And we take people around, talk about the history of the city of New York and about architecture and urbanist questions. Yeah, we had great fun developing this, considering the fact that actually by incident, the developers have really modeled, they had really done an incredible piece of an architectural model, which is actually really perfect to talk about urbanist questions. So we had the idea to make use of it in a better way than the game originally intended.
If we move like into the core, let's say, of your work, which may be really this kind of making use of the gaming space. So is there like a conception of the space of the game that you kind of make fruitful? Can we, I don't know, for instance, say in this rather traditional political metaphor that it's the unconscious of whatever political struggles we have now? I presume you may work with the gaming space as this kind of subconscious political observation?
It's a very good question, a very difficult one to respond to. Current video games, which are the biggest entertainment companies and the biggest revenue machines when it comes to entertainment in the world, much higher than sports and music and films together. So, of course, they are coming out of the society and reaching back to the society, and it's a vice versa influence. I think these are video games. Of course, they consume and digest and transform collective anxieties and paranoias. And also offer solutions for this kind of collective anxieties. Like, why are most of the video games today, a lot of the mainstream ones, are post-apocalyptic? Because we are facing a lot of crisis and so on. So you are thrown into a world in which there is a chaos, mostly a pandemic. There had been like tons of games before we had this pandemic, which a pandemic setting long before. So even this game, like this is, I think it's from 2016 something, yeah? So this New York post-apocalyptic setting of Tom Clancy is a pandemic setting where nothing works any longer, and you are kind of a state militia who is bringing order back, and you are an individual. So you can solve the problem of this world. This is a phantasma people want to have. In the world of late capitalism, we don't have this kind of opportunity, not even to maybe have, most of the people have kind of access to change their own life. We know it from Thomas Piketty, who was kind of scientifically making clear that you don't have any kind of tools in your hand to upgrade your social class on today. Like, he's one of the most influential, or the most influential economics of today.
I just add that I think this is really one of the reasons also of the, I would say, of the utopic quality of video games. That's really like almost like the background trope or background story or like meta story of almost every game is that, you know, you start small, the world is big, and with hard work and investing time, you can control everything and you can defeat even the greatest monsters. There are a few exceptions of video games where this is different, but it's really not a lot of them. Either if it's a strategy game or a shooter, it's basically the same. And I mean, that really takes away, or that, I don't know, I mean, this is really a perfect story of meritocracy, that actually this would be possible, right? That if you just invest enough time and energy, then you can actually reach the top of society. That's something that definitely, it's an experience that you can only have in games, at least most people. And also it's what games offer, or gaming spaces offer, is that you can really see the result of your work, even though it might be repetitive, often absurdly repetitive. If you think of that, many games consist of gameplay where you do the same thing like for hours and hours and hours, and it's not really that fun to do it, but it's rewarding because you really see, you can really progress. That's always somehow the case, that if you really invest time and energy, you end up somewhere and you can develop. And I think that's really something that it's very specific, right? And that might be one of the reasons why people in capitalist societies enjoy so much to play these games, because it fills a gap that reality doesn't really offer.
Okay, moving from, let's say, the space towards the activity or forms of engagement with games, how do you even conceive of your perspective among, let's say, those traditional models of playing, observing, subversively using, or even developing games? You still haven't developed your game on your own. So is for you, for instance, this kind of subversive anti-usage of games, is that the way that can be even generalized beyond, let's say, artistic use?
Yeah, we are not totally dogmatic in that. And we would, of course, I mean, if there's a game developer in the audience who is really interested in working with, I mean, we can talk, but we started with this. I mean, we are 6 people, and what's really common among us is one, that there is a certain political mindset that we share, and the second one is that we are all fascinated by video games and that we also play video games. So we started really as a gaming collective, and that's also like the starting point. And I think that we have this even as a rule, that we're not allowed to change the game in any way, and we just have to play it the way that everybody can play them, and by this means creating something different. So that was kind of our own game that we played with video games, and then we changed it a little bit because we also got interested in modding, and you know, you can make a lot of interesting things by changing or doing modifications of games, using the assets in different ways, changing the way how the game reacts to you and stuff. So we started to do that as well, but we're not so dogmatic, so who knows what the future would bring.
You already touched upon the problem of, let's say, post-apocalyptic framework of current gaming, and this being the dominant form of the world building. I would like to go into more specific detail in terms of first the trauma, because apparently culture really has a lot to do with traumas, and there's music and movies, of course, are doing their job, but in gaming there is maybe something specific about really developing your own whatever resilience or methods of coping with traumas. And the second context where I can kind of go with the post-apocalypticism is actually the post-socialist architecture that you sometimes even use in your video essays. If you can frame this kind of geopolitics of the post or even like socialist world and the world of blocks of flats.
I mean, when it comes to traumas, as I started to say, like in the first panel, I was talking about Steve Bannon. Maybe some of you heard about this quote when he told the story about, I do it very shortly, a guy who is working in an office and has no real agenda to his life, and then he dies, and then on his own funeral, just like the priest and maybe a few other people follow like a generic preach, and then he like completely disappears from the surface while he is within the game. A character, an avatar called Ajax. And this Ajax, when he really died in the game, a lot of people then met. So is the story of Steve Bannon. Thousands of people from around the world resembled themselves and celebrating the funeral of this guy, taking one day off just to be there online. And then Steve Bannon says, I want you, like the right-wing guys of the gamers, I want you to become Ajax and not being the other guy anymore. So he grasps the empowerment strategy games are developing and bring it into the political context. It's interesting why like this hardcore fascist guy is capable of doing that and no left counterpart was that aware of doing the same. So it's a trauma to being incapable of your own personal crisis and traumas within this world and the societal ones. So a lot of people, besides very small amounts of social classes, are incapable of doing anything for their betterment. And this is a collective trauma once. And the other things which games are really, very, very good at is to create a social space. So community, like not just within the pandemics, but also beforehand. So you find someone who is acknowledging your effort. You find some group, and you can really be a master. Maybe you can add something to that.
I just take up the second question maybe and talk about the post-Soviet architecture thing. You're referring to a work that we did last summer, which is called Disaster Tourism. And we were invited to do a tour through post-Soviet architecture. And we found that very interesting in the game DayZ.
From Bohemia Active, like from a Czech Republic.
Of course.
Yeah.
And the starting point for that work was, this is a zombie environment where there's like it plays in a post-Soviet fantasy world, but you can still see that it's meant to represent post-Soviet ruins and stuff. And there's a lot of zombies around, and we did like a bicycle tour through the countryside talking about these phenomena. And our perspective was that, for us, this is really the perspective that we have. We're all born after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the only media representation of these times and of what is left of this society or its remnants or empire, or also the utopic vision that is kind of somewhere behind it. We only know it by the representations that mass media would offer us, and that's how it looks like. So it's ruins and there are zombies around, and it's like, what does this stand for, and what can we make up of this world? That was kind of what was the task for us. And also, of course, kind of go a bit into the fall of this empire and the tragic ending it had in dissolving into capitalist reality.
It was a very delicate matter because we did this kind of tour shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine, and we had been commissioned from the Russian pavilion, partially by Italian curators, partially by Russian curators, who are completely dissident with their regime, of course, I have to say, because they now closed the pavilion in order to make a symbol towards their politics of the country. And we got them on our tour and guided them through the places and let them also speak about it. And what was so fascinating about, next to this representation of Eastern European pastiche of a fallen country, is that the cliche is a very atmospheric one, of course. So we see that there is a lot of suffering going on, but we can't explain it in the Western world. So this kind of situation in which foremost like Russian country or post-Soviet countries are in right now, they had like a collective trauma, which kind of linked to this death of despair, like 5 million people, which is a conservative estimation, had been like killed themselves by suicide or alcoholism or drug abuse. Because from one day to the other, they faced a completely new life with maybe no job and no networks whatsoever. So this kind of situation was somehow brought up by mass media in an atmospheric way. And now we are like in a second layer, we want to redo this with the acknowledgement of the current status of geopolitical situation.
You want to show a part of the work? Maybe
you can play. We engaged a Russian band to make the music to do the music for our film, and we did also during the tour, we did some music videos as well with the clumsy avatars. It's interesting that mass media, like they said, are representing cliches. So from the Western part, we're having this, as Robin before pointed out, we have this kind of cliche of post-Soviet countries and why they are in the situation as they are. And of course, there is a lot of science and a lot of witty knowledge, which completely contradicts our Western approach towards this kind of thematic, like Ivan Krastiev and so on. So it's not to understand Putin, I have to say. It's not to have an approach to say, okay, this was like a dilemmatic situation for him, and it's completely the other way around. So we have to try to break the media representation of Eastern European mass media, which is sold like everywhere and also in the West. And we want to deal with it with the help of a lot of people from the Eastern Europe countries.
I just wanted to precisely ask, what does it mean to you actually to come here to Czech Republic, and if there is some sort of even geopolitical perspective on gaming? Since when we are talking gaming and let's say even capitalism on the internet, we always kind of assume this, cloudish global perspective. I don't know to what extent you actually want to go into some sort of geopolitics of an actual gaming, but maybe I can add my own experience. But since I saw the larger version of the video, it really reminded me of the 90s growing up in Sudetenland in a little town called Chomutov, really surrounded by these huge blocks of flats, where actually the only way how to escape was either gaming or just getting on your bike, and getting to the forest. So that may be the thing that brought me into the gaming, this kind of, again, the utopic aspect of getting elsewhere simply. But this, I don't know if you really want to go into the geopolitics and particularly this kind of post-Soviet, former West, former East kind of division. Maybe it's like still too touchy, but still I would love to go into setting the political ground. The whole day we basically discussed capitalism here, and it has been the prime problem. I don't know whether we got really somewhere else to show some other limits of either internet technologies or gaming. But let's frame gaming in respect to current politics. And you already mentioned the issues of the business, the creative control, the corporatization of gaming. Is there something else in terms of current gaming that is really of a particular interest? And particularly, are there some options to do it otherwise?
Other than all the things you mentioned already. I think it's important to say that, of course, the games are really different. We're working here with a very specific set of games. Even Bohemia Interactive is not the things we're working with classically. Usually it's more fun to make fun of a very stupid, very big game, because oftentimes they are very stupid and very fun to mess around with. So this is not really classical for us, I would say. But it's diverse, right? I mean, you have all this indie sector, which really works really different in capitalism than the big productions where there's so much money involved that they're in the indie sector. It's much more of a risk venture thing with the startup character, where of course the forms of storytelling are totally different because they try something out and if it can work or not, whilst the big games are crazy conservative still because there's so much money involved that they are repeating the same thing all over again and are really taking only minimum risk, which makes the whole thing very stupid to play. And then, which is of course always something we're totally interested in as well, is that's only the one side, right? That's only what people, how the games are done, and the other side is what people actually would do with them. And there is so many more people working with video games in a creative way, and that's a whole other set of questions, which is interesting because of course we're not the only ones doing stupid things with video games, and you can do that, and also people in the community are doing that a lot, and you can really see that. I mean, those things are spaces, you can really work with them, and it's not just a representation like a film, but it's still inviting and you still have a certain possibility to use them in a creative way.
The disobedience about rules is what is kind of the lubricant which lets us getting in completely, and the question of breaking the rules, because these rules are not unpolitical, of course. These rules are a setup of a consensus based on what the hegemony of society is thinking of right now. So breaking the rules stands on the very, very, very beginning of video games, when some pacifist anti-war students were opposing Vietnam War in Massachusetts Institute for Technology and were appropriating huge computers which had been biggest as a room in order to, because these computers had been used for military purposes and they reused it. They appropriated these computers and made the first digital video game, which was a Space War. I mean, there are analog video games before, etc. But this was the very first beginning. So you have the hacktivism, you have the disobedience, you have the reappropriation on the very start, which was actually a pacifist start of this military-influenced entertainment sector of games. And even in Czechoslovakia, there was a lot of disobedience via video games, like Playing Behind the Iron Curtain. I really can recommend this book. So the people, they were all, how do you say, unionized or communalized within groups, sports groups. And if you want to do something, you have to enter one of those groups, and they had been surveilled and controlled nevertheless. But within gaming, which was back then a very, very terra incognita, they kind of introduced disobedience and dissents. So they got a lot of small discs in with like Western games, or they also programmed their own games, which sometimes had been games of disobedience or critique or whatever, or just fun. So this is what we're reclaiming, this huge corporate world. It's just like a huge corporate world. Nevertheless, the games are coming from China or from Czech Republic or from the USA. There's super huge investment projects, and we have to reclaim them back somehow.
That brings me to the connection of gaming and art. It still may be, of course, there's numerous artists actually working with gaming, but I still saw, particularly among the fine artists, huge reluctancy in terms of even having this kind of stereotypical vision of what gaming is.
I think this is good, right? I mean, games are so relevant, and there's still so few artists or also filmmakers actually working with this. I mean, this is absurd. If you think like how many filmmakers make films about filmmaking or about the medium of film, I mean, this is really very, very well represented, I would say. And in regard to that, if you think of how many people are really working a bit more deeper with what video games are and what you can do with them and what they actually mean, like we're still on the beginning. If you think of what a mass mediums games are, we're still really lagging behind a lot in the arts, I would say. I mean, and it's still interesting that after all, if we also do exhibitions sometimes and exhibit our work somewhere in the visual art world. This is still something exotic, and people are still like, video games, so interesting. I never thought about this.
I'm not a gamer myself, but I really find it interesting.
Like, this is absurd, and people can say things like, no, I've never played a video game in my life, but you could never say, like, I've never read a book in my life without losing your face, or I've never watched a movie in my life. I mean, everybody would be like, who are you? But you can still say this confidently in the art scene somehow. So this is, I think it's just necessary that we focus on media that are really relevant nowadays.
I think the art is sometimes at the core of the ruling class. Maybe it's the culture bourgeois aspect of the arts, which is really a huge problem because it tames the critical potential art has. Think of radicalism of art in the modernism time, like in the afterwar and so on. It's really like, I often see art reproducing a consensus within society. Sometimes this consensus is great, but sometimes it's very, very critical. I think it's problematic to do so. And then whatever you do, it's kind of a criticism, and art embrace it anyway. So if you're more radical or whatever, then art anyways, because there is where art belongs. Like Adam Curtis once said that art is kind of the place where the society is performing criticism, rebellion, and dissent. And everything else is okay. And out of this distinction aspect I've drawn out, artists somehow are also out of the background, coming mostly from a bourgeois context like me. The mass media is still something which is maybe a bit nasty, and it's not politically correct. It's something for the masses, and you produce for like your bubble, of course, and maybe for the market. So this is my explanation why artists don't take so much focus on blockbuster or so much focus on video games, because art is a medium of distinction still.
I still wonder about one thing. Maybe you can just answer by screening another video of yours, but still it's the identity politics. Since I'm kind of preoccupied with that, but also we get into this direction of our social background being the determinant factor, but also maybe framing the discussion of the whole day, because it all revolved about the capitalism being bad and the corporations we need to either regulate or change entirely, which is of course what I agree with. But on the other hand, what if there is even some like more underlying problem really connected to how we get represented today, and maybe there is a special relation of that with the gaming?
Our next film we will show is Battlefield, is from the footage of Battlefield 5. So marketing departments misunderstand identity politics at all or whatever. So the solution for a problem is, for example, that you have two opposing fronts in the Second World War, which is the Allies and which is the Nazi Germans. And to make this playable, it's just like that you have women on each side. This is not a problem. This is the problem for the gaming community, actually, which says this is not historic, accurate, and so on, which is bullshit, because most of the things depicted in video games is not like, think of the speed of tanks in video game. I mean, this is ridiculous to talk about historical accuracy, but with the women, they have a problem. But this is not a problem for me or for us. The problem is that Nazi Germans are just like one army, like a normal army than the Allies. So you spawn randomly on one of each sides and then you just fight each other. So maybe you have another answer to it.
No, I probably had said the same thing, which is absurd in this case. That, I mean, you can do really a lot of things in video games and tell a lot of really bullshit stories with very problematic narrations inside it, I would say. Without anyone complaining about it. But adding women to a Second World War scenario, people will get crazy. I mean, the discussion is a little bit absurd altogether. And depoliticizing Second World War is fine, but like this is really funny.
Yeah, you have a lot of other problems, like with Division. You have, we just watch How to Disappear, please.
Battlefield is a multiplayer online shooter. Up to 32 players fight against 32 opponents. And they do that for one reason, to have fun. choosing to fight in a game and trying to convince your comrades to do the same is an act of absurdity, and getting in their way, obstructing their gameplay, won't be interpreted as pacifistic behavior, but as a joke.
So to give you a bit more of a context, How to Disappear is a film about deserting, about running away in war, filmed in Battlefield 5. It was kind of trying to really do an anti-war movie in the Battlefield 5 environment and to tell stories about deserting in real history, to go into that topic, but also to really try out what's the pacifistic possibilities of these spaces and how can you actually break this game in some sense. So you saw, if you didn't understand what you were seeing, actually in those scenes we tried a lot of pacifistic interventions, trying to prevent players from killing each other and getting in their way and harassing a lot of players with pacifistic nonsense in this game.
Yeah, actually, like online performances, like in the former game, they said that we try out like this.
If you want to play another video, yes.
Hardly working, please.
Yeah, please. The file is called Hardly Working.
In the late afternoon, the stable hand carries bales of straw from the storage yard to the paddock. Tomorrow morning, all this straw will have disappeared, and the yard will once again be full, without a single horse having been taken care of. Everything is already there. Nothing inscribes itself. Nothing can change. It's hard to imagine a world without progress. Our faith in tomorrow's abundance is an imperative to keep everything going. It drives us forward without a sense of direction. In capitalism, the future is an asset, and it's already been sold. A paper-thin promise, masking deeply corrupted mechanics, creating a world caught in a state of permanent, raging presence.
We have to introduce that film.
Yeah, very briefly, Hardly Working is about NPCs, so the non-playable characters, the characters in background, in this case of Red Dead Redemption 2. And it's something we follow the NPCs in their daily lives, so the extras in the background that don't really play a big role in the game usually. And we follow 4 characters for a whole day. We did a lot of observations, almost ethnographic-like observations of their life, what they do, and also specifically about what they produce, because they go to work every day, they put nails into wood or sweep the floor, but of course they cannot change the environment they are living in at any case. This is totally impossible for them to reach any kind of status, change of status through their work. So they're totally trapped. And at the same time, they are often laggy and also they kind of refuse to work in the way they are intended to do, which we found very
stimulating in the sense that in the way they are glitching or are mistaking, they're becoming human as machines. So it's the same if you think of workers who are about to do what is intended to do, like a machine within an apparatus. And if they kind of having their personal story dragged into the firm or in their job, whatever they do, it's something personal. And this we used as a metaphor to think of our current notion of labor.
And what we can learn from the NPCs was the question that we posed.
So is there a question?
Hi, thank you for your really nice talk. I wanted to ask about your interaction with real players. Like, what are their reactions when you are filming these videos? Because that was like the first question that popped into my mind. Like, if you do it in a sterile environment, or then you mentioned that you actually involve the players. Is that like a part of your work as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we do like this very much. This is a good question. It's, of course, part of the fascination that comes for video games is, of course, not only the narration and storytellings and all the problematic things about them, but also that they are actually social spaces and you can meet people there. We met a colleague of ours who is now a member of our team inside a video game. So it works. And, of course, this is always something we try to implement to our works, or sometimes we try to do that, is exactly what you said, to test out how people react if you do something absurd or something different. In that case, I mean, it always, as we use games in a very parasitic way, it really depends from game to game how social interactions are possible or not, and how people would react. It really depends very much, and it really is different if you try it in the battle royale environment or if you try it in a place where their long-lasting social relations are possible. Battlefield, in this case, is a game where you usually meet people only for one game or for a set of games, and you never see them again. You're also not punished in any way if you behave weirdly. Usually you cannot even get kicked out of the servers. It's very specific. In that case, I think most people were irritated and got angry with us because we ruined the game for them. Because if you imagine, like, it's two teams fighting against each other, and we were always like a crowd of 4 people refusing to fight.
Or even 6 sometimes.
I mean, definitely your team will lose. So we ruined a lot of games, and people didn't like that very much. A few of them commented in a bad way, but I can understand them. But there were a few interactions which were totally the opposite, and people found it extremely funny. Of course, people are playing video games also because they want to experience something. If then something extraordinary happens, sometimes people are interested in what's going on. Anyway, this is their free time. So a lot of times people joined us also. So in the snippet that you saw, actually, there's one random person just joined our performance there right on top and found it funny and was robbing around the floor with us for a while. So yeah, it depends.
There's one question more.
First of all, I'm surprised that you didn't get banned for griefing. Just to explain, griefing is intentional harming of the game goal, so I would imagine you would get banned. So that's a good sign you didn't. But my question is actually, and it's related to the other part of the program here, we are also showing right now actually Harun Farokhi and his Serious Games investigation into the game adjacent simulation used during the actual battle training of soldiers and this military entertainment complex kind of thing. Is that of interest to you as well, or do you prefer to stay in the pop culture way games are militarized, let's say? Because because virtual battle system is check.
I mean, here in Battlefield, just to be smart, it's not possible to grieve, because as Robin pointed out, like, you will, like, few minutes of being in this map, the map ends, the game ends, and grieving means that you follow someone for hours and making the life of this person really, really hard. Which is interesting, because actually there is a police in some games from the community which tries to get rid of those people. So with the Reaper dogs, I think, and other groups in Red Dead Redemption 2 from the last game we saw, there is really like an order of people, like a very, very strict community of people who really take serious, a bit molested and getting rid of those people. But of course, we love Harun Farokhi. Harun Farokhi is one of the godfathers of essay film, and the link between poesy, politics, and mass media. When he approaches video games in his 2 works, Parallels and Serious Games, he's presenting this mass media to an audience which is so flabbergasted and so mesmerized by the hyperrealism of these simulations of imageries of our world. So he isn't telling the gaming community something new, I would say. So he's not surprising maybe people who know games a lot. And this maybe sounds narcissistic, but this is what we really want to do, and where we continue his road and add something on top of him.
But we always try to make films or works that are interesting for people that really play the games because they see it with different eyes, and also projects that our mothers would also like and enjoy to watch. So those are the 2 core target groups.
I hope it's not going to be, again, just my crazy para-academic interest, but if we can move tiny bit into theory of games, theory of technology, if there is actually some sort of resort or some sort of referential framework that you would work with, because I think the theory is constantly failing in terms of actually grasping what's happening, in terms of actually deploying some real workable alternatives from the age of cybernetics and cyberpunk, from from network theory or net art discourse or whatever post-accelerationisms and post-Marxisms. So do we actually have some workable framework at the moment?
It really changed a lot through the pandemics, like game art is actually like the genre we are in, or machinima, doing films within video games. So, as well as the materialist perspective on video games. During I wrote my doctoral thesis, which is now applied to the university, I was so astonished by the material which appeared, which spawned. And there is a lot of great theory, which sometimes made my research obsolete. So there is like people like Soraya Murray or Eugen Pfister, and even on left-wing magazines like Jacobin, they are really focusing on this phenomenon. I mean, there is a lot said before, of course, with the critical theory, so you can just adapt it, and it's often used. And what's interesting is that also the theory, which was mainly male-dominated, also becomes more and more focused by female researcher.
What is it that we wish for in gaming? Are there some particular strategies, futures, some utopias of gaming on the horizon?
We had been witnessing a few of the panels today and all claim for democratization. It seems like that's the way to go. So the problem is that even this huge marketing-fueled mass media corporations like Ubisoft or Electronic Arts or Activision or whatever, they don't take the community that serious. Nevertheless, they always claim for. So they release a sequel after the other, and always the community is raging about making the game worse and worse because of marketing decisions. And nevertheless, the community goes away. The game sells quite brilliantly because first of marketing, and second, because there's increasing demand for games. So they don't care. They simply don't care about the community. There are a lot of examples for that, which is completely crazy. Games got really fucked by the market logics. So we need a different kind of logics within mainstream games, because we do have this sometimes or a lot with indie games, and that they're made out of the purpose of telling a story or really trying to bring innovation into the field. But for the mainstream game, which approach hundreds of millions of people, they simply needs to be democratized in whichever way. There is also like the industry is it's one of the most perverted industries when it comes to labor rights. So some of the people from the development companies, they just like flip to the military sector and so on, like Bohemia Games from Activision. They even have a department which is just like for making money with military imaginary and engines and so on. So there is a lot to do, but not a concrete vision. Besides that, we have to democratize it, either from the users as well, maybe from the side of the law.
I'd add that, I mean, I don't know for the world, but for video games, I mean, there had been at least a few really great titles being released in the last years. And I think the medium is still growing up and interesting. There's still so much more to come, actually, and so much more that would be possible to try out. But I think also that it's just like capitalism is a terrible framework for developing good games. Now there was the story of, I don't know if many of you played maybe Disco Elysium, but this was definitely one of the most remarkable games that had been released in the last years. When it comes to storytelling, you should all play it, definitely. The team that developed it, they had been developing it for, 30 years or something, like the whole cosmos that is there actually. And now as the game was a success, they had been basically fired from the studios and now are not able to work with the material they had created themselves. So basically, like as soon as money is involved and capitalist interests are really growing, then this is bad for interesting things. So this is just for the sake of creating good computer game contents. We should all be interested in changing the economic system we're having.
So now we have particular reason to overthrow capitalism. It's
finally, yeah.
Okay, it motivates me anyway.
So it does to me as well, yeah.
There is one question, right?
Yeah, it wasn't a question, but I just wanted to correct Leonhard about Bohemia Interactive and Bohemia Interactive Simulations, I believe. I'm not sure what's the name of the second one, but they are completely separate right now. It's just not coincidence, but they were together in the past, but right now they are completely different companies which have nothing in common. It's a long history right now, so it's not the department of Bohemia Interactive anymore.
Thank you for updating me. Yeah, Bohemia Interactive, they saw our film, two of the developers, How to Disappear the Disobedience Deserting film, and below in the commentary section of Vimeo, they really discussed our film and they were not super aligned. They were really fighting each other, like two developers of Bohemia Interactive. This was something really particular for us.
Posing very legit critique of the film.
Are we outside the framework of our time already?
We still have almost 10 minutes.
Okay, then let's get into Super Wonder.
There's a question. Let's have the question before, right?
Yeah, it's a very small one. I would say the games share DNA, definitely. And also the Bohemia Interactions is now owned by the British art manufacturer, which is also very funny. Anyway, my question is there, according to you, such thing as ethical playing? I have an example, because you mentioned Activision Blizzard, and I noticed this sentiment after the sexual misconduct allegations about an anti-union crackdowns on Activision Blizzard came out. Some more, I'd say, critical or left-aligned YouTubers were calling for boycotting of the company and essentially blaming media for even covering the games the company, which is obviously atrocious, keeps releasing. But then again, also, I enjoy Overwatch 2, so is there such a thing as ethical playing? Should I stop playing Overwatch 2? I don't know, do you think about the consumption side of things?
When you're talking about two things, we don't have a problem to play war. I think this is where war belongs. Games itself, either if they have been analog or digital, they follow the trace of military settings. So it's a problem when it comes to gender, because we need to have a completely different kind of also gameplay and not just Sims, like simulating capitalism and founding a family, but something else for women. So this is one point. So it's not a problem to shoot someone in the head if this is kind of the antagonism, but you have to tell the rest of the story. So you have to tell what war is also doing. There are very few examples who are really responsible in their narration and so on. And the other story is that you have this sexual harassment, you have this very toxic environment of gaming development companies and so on. It's not different, like if I'm leaning towards the other or linking towards the other talks about the internet or social media, it's not different to the other digital environments. They're toxic too. It's a system above of all, this kind of media which brings up toxic things, brings women into unnecessary distress and horror situation and filters a lot of hegemonial imageries into the people who are then becoming first frustrated and secondly maybe biased. So it's the framework above, I would say.
I guess the gaming industry is one of the most difficult fields when it comes to labor issues and exploitation issues. And this is, of course, a big topic. We heard it today, of course, they are also outsourcing and there's a lot of pressure and people are underpaid and all these kind of problems. And then there is this specificity, I guess, to this industry that is specifically toxic and other terrible things happen over proportionally there. I don't know. I think these things definitely need to change. I'm not so sure about if a boycott of one certain company is the right strategy to really address this. I think labor unions are much better equipped usually to deal with this kind of issues. Yet, I think, on the other hand, if a well-organized boycott may also change the rules of how this industry works to a certain degree. But I think you only yourself now not playing this game, refusing to play this will probably not change a lot. But if you think bigger, maybe you can have a small impact.
As I told, with Battlefield, the predecessor of that game, even if 100,000 or even million people are boycotting the game, it doesn't change because it's still getting sold. It's completely ignored. So the masses getting ignored by that.
And also, the biggest companies are the worst employers, I guess. If you think of Rockstar or all the other big employers, they are all really terrible. I mean, this couldn't be worse almost.
It's a simulation of our world, which you can enter in video games, and it's not so different than the rest of the world. That's, I think, the line.
Thank you.
You have just listened to the last episode of the 4th season of Screenshot, a podcast series from the Inspiration Forum. This season we covered topics such as degrowth, digital platforms, war in Ukraine, or the transformative potential of nonviolent communication. Thanks for listening and being inspired by the thoughts of our guests. You can find all Screenshot episodes at inspirationforum.com/podcasts and in all podcast apps.